It was a typical late-night shift for Ethan, a pizza delivery guy in a small, rural town. He had been working at his local pizza place for a few years, and he was used to the long, empty roads that connected the isolated houses scattered across the countryside. Tonight seemed no different from any other. It was just after midnight, and his last delivery of the night had come in. A single large pizza to an address deep in the woods. Ethan punched the coordinates into his GPS, noting that the house was about 15 miles out of town, past the local highway and along a gravel road that he had never traveled before. He shrugged it off and loaded the pizza into his old car, cranking up the radio to keep himself entertained during the long drive. As he left the main road and turned onto the gravel path, his car bounced along uneven terrain, and the trees grew denser around him. The only light came from his headlights, and the woods seemed to swallow the sound of his engine. The house wasn't marked, and his GPS gave an error signal. He had to rely on the coordinates on the map and find it by sight. After a few more minutes of driving, Ethan spotted a dim light far in the distance. It had to be the house. Pulling up to the property, he noticed that the house was old, almost forgotten by time. It looked like it hadn't been cared for in years, with peeling paint and broken shutters. A single light flickered inside, casting an eerie glow through the cracked windows. He got out of his car, grabbed the pizza, and started walking toward the front door. But as he approached, he realized something wasn't right. The door was slightly ajar, and there was no sign of anyone inside. Ethan knocked, calling out for the customer. "Pizza delivery," he said, but no response. His voice echoed through the trees, followed only by the sound of crickets. Just as he was about to leave, he heard a faint rustling sound coming from the woods behind the house. Ethan turned around, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. A chill ran down his spine as the rustling grew louder, closer. It sounded like footsteps, but heavier, almost like something dragging through the brush. The rational side of his brain told him it was probably just an animal, but his instinct screamed at him to get out of there. He quickly set the pizza on the porch and started backing away toward his car. That's when he saw it, a dark figure moving through the trees, just at the edge of the light. It was tall, hunched, and moving in a way that didn't seem quite human. Ethan's heart pounded as the figure stepped closer, revealing its grotesque appearance. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its long, twisted limbs moved unnaturally, almost like they were broken. He didn't wait to find out what it was. Ethan bolted to his car, throwing the door open and jumping inside. As he fumbled for his keys, he saw the figure approaching fast, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. Ethan finally managed to start the car and slammed on the gas, tearing out of the driveway. His tires spun on the gravel, and for a moment, he thought he wouldn't make it. But as his car lurched forward, he caught a glimpse of the thing in his rearview mirror. It was standing right where he had been, watching him leave, its dark, soulless eyes locked on his car. Ethan didn't stop until he was back on the highway, and even then, his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. He called the pizza place to report what happened, but when the police checked the address, they found the house abandoned. No one had lived there in years. To this day, Ethan refuses to take any deliveries to houses in the woods, especially at night. Whatever he saw that night, he knew one thing for sure: it wasn't human. Hey everyone, I noticed that 99.7% of my views come from non-subscribers. If you're enjoying the horror stories on Mystic Spooky, please hit that subscribe button to support the channel. It only takes a second, and it helps me keep creating more spooky content. Jenna had been a delivery driver for a year, and she enjoyed the quiet nights. The roads were usually empty, and her deliveries were quick. But one night, she got an order that made her stomach churn. It was past midnight when she was assigned to deliver to a house in a neighborhood known for being sketchy. The area had seen a rise in crime recently, with reports of break-ins and even assaults. But Jenna needed the extra money, so she took the order and started her drive. The house was about 20 minutes away, located at the far end of a rundown street with only a few dim streetlights. As she pulled up to the address, her headlights illuminated a small, dilapidated house with no lights on inside. She checked the address twice. This was the right place. Jenna knocked on the door, but no one answered. After waiting a minute, she knocked again, louder this time. Still, no answer. She thought about calling the number on the order, but then she heard the sound of a car engine behind her. She turned around and saw an old, beat-up sedan pulling up to the curb. A man stepped out, and her heart immediately sank. He looked disheveled, wearing a dirty hoodie and jeans that were too long for him. He was staring at her, unblinking, with a strange smirk on his face. Jenna felt a wave of unease wash over her as he slowly approached. "You got my pizza?" he asked, his voice low and gruff. She nodded, trying to stay calm. "Yeah, it's $12.50. The man reached into his pocket but didn't pull out any money. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. Jenna backed up slightly, her hand tightening around the pizza box. "You got a problem, girl?" he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. She didn't answer, instinctively taking another step back. That's when she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. Another figure standing at the far end of the street, watching them from the shadows. Before Jenna could react, the man lunged at her, grabbing the pizza box and shoving her back against the door. She screamed, dropping the pizza and trying to push him away, but he was stronger than she expected. Just as he raised his fist to strike, the second figure came running toward them, shouting for him to stop. The man froze for a second, then cursed under his breath and took off down the street, disappearing into the darkness. Jenna's rescuer, a middle-aged woman, quickly helped her to her feet. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice trembling. "I've seen him hanging around this neighborhood before. You need to call the police." Shaken but grateful, Jenna nodded and immediately called 911. The woman stayed with her until the police arrived, and Jenna never went back to that neighborhood again. It was a calm Friday night, and Ethan was on his last delivery shift for the local pizza place. After months of the same routine, he was ready to leave the job for good. He'd already accepted a better offer elsewhere, and just wanted to finish this final shift without any drama. As his phone buzzed with one last order, Ethan glanced at the address. It was for a remote house on the outskirts of town. He didn't recognize the street, but he figured it was just another late-night customer too lazy to cook. He punched the address into his GPS, grabbed the pizza, and hopped into his car. The drive took him farther away from the city than expected, down winding roads with barely any streetlights. Tall trees lined both sides of the road, their branches swaying ominously in the breeze. Ethan couldn't shake the unsettling feeling in his gut, but he chalked it up to fatigue. He'd be done soon enough, he reminded himself. When the GPS announced that he had arrived, Ethan found himself parked outside a large, gated property. The house was barely visible behind the towering iron gate and overgrown bushes. He parked his car on the street, got out, and noticed a small side entrance for pedestrians, left slightly ajar. There was no driveway bell, so he let himself in, cautiously walking up the dimly lit path toward the front door. As he approached, he noticed how eerily silent the surroundings were. No crickets, no wind, just silence. The house itself was old, its windows dark, and no lights were on outside. Despite his instincts telling him to leave, he knocked on the door and waited. A few seconds passed before the door creaked open slightly, revealing a man wearing a white mask shaped like a pig's face. "Pizza delivery?" Ethan said, holding up the pizza box. The masked man nodded slowly, stepping aside without saying a word. The sight of the mask made Ethan's skin crawl, but he tried to remain professional. He stepped into the foyer and immediately noticed how dark and cold it was inside. No lights, no warmth. It felt as if the house had been abandoned for years. He could smell the faint odor of mildew and something else he couldn't quite place. "I'll just, wait here while you grab the money," Ethan said, already planning his exit. The man in the pig mask disappeared around the corner, leaving Ethan standing awkwardly in the entryway. Moments later, another figure emerged from a nearby room, this one wearing a deer mask. They said nothing as they stared at Ethan, their heads slightly tilted, as if examining him. Ethan's nerves were now on high alert. He wasn't just creeped out, he was scared. He tried to play it cool. "Hey, you guys having a costume party or something?" The figure in the deer mask didn't respond. Instead, they turned and walked back into the dark room they had come from, the door closing with an unsettling thud. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He needed to leave. Now, as he backed up toward the front door, he noticed shadows moving from behind the walls, like more people were watching him. He could hear faint footsteps coming from upstairs, echoing through the house. Just as he was about to bolt, the pig-masked man returned, this time accompanied by a third figure wearing a goat mask. They stood there, blocking his path to the door. "Where's the money?" Ethan asked, trying to mask the fear in his voice. The pig-masked man held out a crumpled bill, but as Ethan reached for it, the man pulled it back and grunted something unintelligible. The figures began to close in on him, and Ethan knew he was in trouble. Without thinking, he dropped the pizza box and shoved the pig-masked man out of his way, darting toward the door. The other masked figures lunged at him, but Ethan managed to dodge them, his adrenaline surging. He fumbled with the door handle for a second, but finally yanked it open, sprinting out into the cold night air. As he ran down the long pathway toward the gate, he could hear footsteps pounding behind him. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw the pig-masked man and the others chasing after him. Their masks shone faintly in the moonlight, and their distorted shapes seemed to get closer with each step. Ethan's lungs burned as he pushed himself to run faster. He reached the gate, slammed it shut behind him, and raced to his car. He jumped in, slammed the door, and hit the gas, speeding away without looking back. It wasn't until he was several miles down the road that he finally allowed himself to breathe. His hands shook violently as he clutched the steering wheel, replaying the bizarre encounter in his mind. The eerie silence, the masks, the way they moved, it all felt like some twisted nightmare. Ethan decided to stop at a gas station on the way back to the pizzeria, needing a moment to gather his thoughts. He called his boss and explained what happened, but his boss was dismissive, saying it was probably just a weird party. That didn't sit right with Ethan, but he didn't argue. He told his boss he was done for the night and that he'd never be coming back to work. The next morning, Ethan checked the local news, half expecting to see a report about a strange group of masked people. But there was nothing. No reports, no complaints, just silence. To this day, Ethan still has no idea what was going on in that house, and he's grateful that he never stuck around to find out. Every time he drives past that road now, he feels a chill run down his spine, and he makes sure to stay as far away as possible.